You've got suggestions near the end of the book for things that basically we're going to have to do, 4 or 5 steps that pretty much are going to have to be in whatever policy.
We've tried the triangle of voluntarism, exhortation, and subsidy. We tried that, and it failed. And it's going to keep failing because that's the evidence from other countries as well as our own. So essentially you have to use the good old free market. And one of the reasons I was attracted to working with Mark, who'd done a lot more thinking about this than I had, was that he said, which I agree with, in a market economy that we have, you have to use the market. And in order to use the market, you have to send the right signals to the market and from the market, which means you have to price things, in this case carbon, in such a way that people don't produce products that emit and don't buy them that emit much. And as a consequence, incentives go in another way. And you have to back that up with a series of regulations. And that's the general framework of how I think we can make progress.
Everybody seemed in those early days to be talking about voluntary cooperation. I don't know about you, but when I drive past a school, I don't always slow down to 40 because, sometimes it's midnight and, or whatever. But it's a good idea that there's a cop there occasionally making sure that people do get pulled over. The carrot's fine, but without the stick.
Well, exactly, and I think I find it interesting that you use that example because that's an example that I use quite frequently. Is we all believe that we should share the values of not speeding in our vehicles past school areas, and so we all share that value. So if we share that, why aren't we doing that in a voluntary basis? Why aren't we just having government ads, maybe Rick Mercer commercials, and things like that? Just trying to inform us and remind us, and then we'll use pressure on each other to not speed through school zones. But as your example gave, there are reasons why even rational people who mean well will say, well, there's no kids around right now, so I can speed. I don't see anyone, and I'm in a hurry. We all have rationalizations for decisions that we make. And so the question that I pose is, if you're going to try to reduce something like greenhouse gas emissions, which are so easily emitted because I can buy a backyard patio heater and it's really nice and convenient and not really pay much attention to the fact that those emissions are going up. There are just so many things in a modern market economy, new innovations that I can acquire that will cause greenhouse gas emissions. Why would we even expect that some kind of total reliance on voluntarism, information, and a few subsidies would actually reduce emissions? So that there's now, fortunately, we have this long track record of evidence that those policies have failed. The discourse has changed, and that's good news. It's now more to, okay, just like the school zones, we're going to have financial penalties for behavior to make sure everyone complies. We're going to have to even have regulations like taking away your driver's license if you're a repeat offender. We don't just keep upping the fine. We eventually have to take more regulatory means. So the discourse has moved to that on climate change. And now my concern and our concern that we bring out in the book is that now politicians can come out and say, okay, we are putting in prices and we are doing these regulations, but in fact you can design them in ways that they too are ineffective. You can have the government of Quebec say, we're going to bring in a carbon tax, and that's what I've been calling for 20 years, and most independent experts, but the carbon tax is minuscule. There's no schedule about how it would increase, and in fact the government says right away, we expect this carbon tax not to change the prices for consumers. Somehow it's supposed to be swallowed by industry. So there would be an example of finally getting the policy right, but in fact the policy is ineffective as designed. Another one would be the federal government today, the Conservatives, putting in some kind of cap system for the emissions from industry. And then, at least as we describe it in the book, designed with what I call loopholes, opportunities for industry not to reduce its emissions by, again, perhaps paying someone to insulate a house, even if that house is going to end up much bigger and still use a lot of energy. So I'm onto that second phase now where we're starting to talk about the right policies, but you can't let your guard down.
Politically, who's in the best position to put forward process that's going to work? Because we have lofty goals, but
I'm going to answer this in a counterintuitive way, which is the Conservatives are.
Really?
Yeah, because I've said this for decades to my conservative friends. I said, what is the root of the word conservative? It's an old Latin word, and in English it's conserve. So I used to say to them decades ago, you ought to own the environment, because if conservatives stand for anything, they ought to stand for the preservation, the conservation, the organic nature of society. That's what conservatism, as I understand it properly described, should be. So you guys should own the environment. You need to preserve and protect and conserve the legacy of the past, the good legacy, which is what we've been given. They don't have a kind of long history of tub thumping on this. So if they can be made to convert, then they'll bring along their own supporters. The other folks are kind of already there intellectually. Secondly, the conservatives are supposed to be the free market types, right? And we're saying, look, what will work here is the proper application of free market principles, which are fairly well understood. And you conservatives should be able to marry your conserve, preserve principles, if you have any, with your adherence to the market. The left, when the left does things that are counterintuitive, people pay attention. Like when the left supports military intervention somewhere, it's so unexpected that people say, well, Jesus, I guess we better do this. And when the right comes along and says we really should preserve the environment by using our old economic tools as free market types, including taxes and price signals, people say, well, Jesus, if they say that, well, maybe we should do it.
The book is Hot Air, Meeting Canada's Climate Change Challenge. I'm speaking with the authors Jeffrey Simpson and Mark Jaccard, and Hot Air, published by Maclellan Stewart.